Volya Radio. Slava Ukraini.
We've got David Kirichenko coming up because he wrote a report, 8th of October it was, presented it to the UK Parliament. It's entitled Military Lessons for NATO from Russian-Ukraine War, preparing for the wars of tomorrow. And it took me 4 hours today to read it, but I read it all today, 64 pages of it. It's very good, actually. It's very detailed. I do have some questions. It should be up in the nest. I think it's the latest tweet. Yeah. So if the latest tweet in the nest, there's a link there to the Henry Jackson Society. You've got to go through some I Am Human thing to be able to read it, and then and you get a little excerpt at the top. So I downloaded the PDF and read the PDF. So yeah, it covers quite a lot of stuff. We're going to cover all that with David. So that's quite good.
That is amazing stuff. I just saw the article and downloaded it and I could see the headlines and stuff, but it sounds like a lot of interesting things.
Yeah, it does cover quite a few areas. All right, I want to welcome David Kirichenko. Welcome.
Thank you. I actually had the opportunity to meet with Shaggy this weekend in London, so it was a fortuitous meeting, and good seeing you and meeting you in person, and also thank you for having me on.
You're welcome. I was kind of hoping Mick Ryan would be sightseeing in London and wandering around and pop in, but that didn't happen. That wish didn't get made. Not all your wishes come true, but it could have been good. Right, David, we're going to be talking about your reports. But if you just want to introduce yourself to our audience who haven't didn't listen to the last interview in the other place, as I quite like to call it. So yeah, a little introduction, David.
Yeah, well, I'm Ukrainian American. I've been working throughout the war and on the front line, so have been in areas such as the battle for Bakhmut in 2022, and last year was on also the eastern and southern fronts. This year, most recently, I just came back from Chasiv Yar. I was also in the Kharkiv area near the Russian border, not far from Vovchansk. Then was also on the southern front line, and just spending time with different units, tank units, artillery units, drone units. And then apart from my work as a journalist, I'm also a researcher. I'm an associate research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. And the report that I'm going to be talking about is a research paper that I wrote for them, and also had the opportunity to present last week at the House of Commons at the British Parliament. And the report itself is military lessons from the Russia-Ukraine war for NATO, preparing NATO for the wars of tomorrow. And so focusing both on traditional military lessons, technological advancements from the war, just among other lessons that I thought were relevant for NATO countries to take away and to prepare not only to potentially confront a Russia that invades Europe in the future, but I think relevant lessons in the wars that might be fought against entities like China or North Korea in the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that introduction. Yeah, I mean, I read the report today. It took me 4 hours. It's 64 pages. It's a chunky document. It's very detailed, David. I enjoyed it a lot, actually. It did spring a few questions into my mind. But if you want to, I can ask those questions a little bit later, maybe after we've gone through the various sections of the report, if you want to talk about them. I don't know where you want to start. Maybe the key background themes of what the report covers.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely won't be able to cover the entirety of the report, but I think I'll try to flag what I think are the more relevant aspects of the report. But I think that the report starts out by first pointing out what Russia's motivations are for the war. And we can go back really hundreds of years of the formation of the Russian state, and how Russian rulers for hundreds of years have attempted to build Russia's identity off of the idea that Ukraine belongs to Russia from the Kiev and Rus times. And the Russian rulers use that as a way to invade the neighboring provinces and to claim that they're the descendants and the rightful heirs of the Kiev and Rus state. And so from then on out, from Peter the Great to Catherine the Great, and all of Russia's imperial rulers have built off of this narrative that we must destroy Ukraine's identity and subjugate the Ukrainians because they are one with the Russians. And you even see Putin in his 2021 letter writing those same narratives, that Ukraine and Russia are one people, and Ukraine's independence can only come with the consent of Moscow. While I don't talk about this in the report, I think it's important to point out, because there's been recent discussions on this of how did Western analysts get Russia and Ukraine so wrong? Why, to this very day, do so many of the Western policymakers and advisors truly not understand, I think, the nuances and complexities of Russia, Ukraine, the history, and what really motivates both sides to fight? And that continues to inform like the policies and how the West approaches both supporting Ukraine and confronting Russia. And so I think the first step is understanding that this war has been in the making for a long time. I think recently I read within the last year of declassified documents that Boris Yeltsin asked his advisors about potentially nuking Ukraine when he heard that they were breaking away from the Soviet Union. You also had the Russians attempt to seize Crimea for the first time in 1994. And again, this is happening under Russia's supposedly first democratic administration. But nonetheless, once Putin comes to office in 2000, and there was an approachment with the West. We saw George Bush and Putin standing, and George Bush saying something like, "I looked Putin in the eyes and saw that he was a good person." And so you see that Putin is just lively, he's engaging with Western audiences, but then 2004 happens, and we see the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and that was a shock to Putin and the Russian elites that the Ukrainian people did not want to be connected to Russia's sphere of influence and wanted to join a free and prosperous European alliance. And after 2004, Russia became very hostile, and their foreign policy towards Ukraine and the West changed radically. And in 2008, we had the invasion of Georgia. And then a couple of years later, the red line that Obama supposedly had in Syria. Then we had the invasion of Ukraine after the Euromaidan revolution. And that wasn't even about NATO, that was about Putin thinking that he could subjugate Ukraine through the Eurasian Economic Alliance that he was attempting to build. And once the Ukrainians had the revolution, were attempting to join the economic alliance within Europe, he then invaded Ukraine. And then once he realized that the Ukrainians still wouldn't capitulate through the Minsk agreements, he realized that he had no choice but to invade Ukraine. And then many Western analysts thinking from the narrative that Russia is an all elite power, they're nuclear power, and so we must respect them as a one-for-one peer. And I think it really blinded many people to the fact that Russia has controlled the information space around Ukraine for literally hundreds of years. They've dominated this, they've subjugated the Ukrainians, that people did not understand just how willing the Ukrainians were to fight, and how for hundreds of years the Ukrainians consolidated under a more decentralized state or entity since the Kazakh times, but also that the Ukrainians for hundreds of years have fought for freedom, whereas the Russians have consolidated around a central state with a powerful ruler. So just not even understanding the histories of Russia and Ukraine, and the complexities of both Ukrainian and Russian societies blinded Western analysts, Western leaders. And so you had folks like Samuel Sharab and others arguing shortly, even before the full-scale invasion, that no amount of Western weapons or technology would allow Ukraine, would help Ukraine in any way. But then, to the contrary, once the Russians invaded, carrying victory parade uniforms, the Ukrainians not only showed such defiant resistance, but they beat back the Russians from the Battle of Kiev and showed that like Ukraine does have the capacity to win, and Russia's not as strong as the world once thought. And the Ukrainians really turned, realizing that confronting the Russians one for one with a country that has much more firepower and superiority. Ukraine's theme throughout the war has been both a war of the common people, where you had volunteers building entire supply chains for the military, delivering drones. We're seeing more and more of the average citizen participating in war. So again, buying these drones, buying Starlings, delivering it to Ukrainian soldiers. And then you also see Ukraine throughout the war relying on more and more of its domestic drone industry and weapons production to wage asymmetrical warfare to try to tip the scales where it could have against Russia. And so while Ukraine did have numerous successes in 2022, I think the frustrating part is that when Ukraine is doing well, Western leaders sit back and say, okay, we're going to ride on Ukraine's momentum and courage to carry them to the day, to quote somebody inside the Biden administration when Ukraine waged the 2023 counteroffensive. But when things are going wrong or not going well, we see Western leaders, Western policymakers start speaking up about the need for negotiations. And again, it's a misreading and lack of understanding of Russia, is that Russia respects power, it respects strength. And John Sullivan, the U.S. ambassador, both under the Trump and Biden administration, said that the Russians, when they negotiate, they shoot for the moon. They negotiate with extreme paranoia, with extremist and maximalist demands, and they're unwavering. And you see that with Putin not being serious about negotiations whatsoever, when he's saying that without Western aid, Ukraine would collapse within 1 week. For him, when he said within the last few months, is that to even start negotiations, he would keep all the occupied territories, and just to even start the negotiations. But Ukraine understands that Russia, to bring them to the negotiating table, it needs to show strength, it needs to project force. And earlier this year, when the Biden administration was frustrated with the Ukrainians launching drone attacks against the oil refineries, it actually brought the Russians, as the Washington Post reported, to potentially negotiate in Qatar to free strikes on the energy grids of one another. And so we see that trying to reason with the Russians really hasn't produced anything, but showing strength on the battlefield and inflicting damage on the Russians is what really will, at a minimum, bring the Russians to the negotiating table. And so the Ukrainians, realizing that they're unable to rely both on the supply of aid and the aid coming in, they really leveraged technology and the evolution of it as best as they could have to fight back against the Russians. So on the drone front, you have the Ukrainians, for a time being, at the start of the war, you had the Bayraktar Turkish drone having a big impact, hitting the Russian convoys going into Kiev. But you also had the Ukrainians building sea drones. And so I think one big theme of the war, or one area that Ukraine has been winning, has been the battle for the Black Sea, of Ukraine developing these cheap, small drones, marine drones, and hitting the Russian fleet and neutralizing much of their threat from the Black Sea. And then on pivoting to a different area, but as the war began to freeze up to a certain extent after the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson and Kharkiv in 2022, I think the West got comfortable and thought Ukraine was in a good place and we can allow the conflict to freeze up. And then we allowed the Russians to build one of the most fortified defensive lines. And then we were pushing the Ukrainians to wage that counteroffensive. And the challenge of that was both around, I think, less than half of all the promised military aid came in on time. Ukraine also sharing military intelligence and doing planning for the offensive between so many different NATO countries allowed intelligence leaks. So it was easy for the Russians to figure out which brigades were being equipped by the Ukrainians, and they were able to just track those brigades and know exactly where the Ukrainians were going to attack. And so the counteroffensive was doomed to fail from the start. And we did not set up the Ukrainians for success whatsoever, both from the aid promised and not giving the Ukrainians just additional weaponry to strike at the Russians. And so you see that the Russians both absorbed the counteroffensive, and then we see that the West started to grow less and less motivated to support Ukraine, going on additional offensives or just giving them additional capabilities to fight back. And the Russians understood that this is becoming a war of attrition, and that all that they need to do is grind out the will of the Western powers and the NATO countries supporting Ukraine. And so the Russians began to throw everything not only onto the battlefield, and waging these offensives that are currently going even till this very day, but the Russians realize that the battlefield no longer is not just to the physical battlefield, but it extends to many other domains. And one of the big ones that we saw was the information space, that how effectively the Russians have been able to influence the Western alliance. And specifically, if we look back at the U.S. military aid that was, or just the U.S. aid to Ukraine that was halted for a certain time late last year and into this year, we saw that the Ukrainians, had to retreat from Avdiivka, but the Ukrainians also suffered extensive losses, losing many of its best soldiers trying to hold Avdiivka. And there was the case of multiple Republican congressmen talking about Zelensky buying yachts with the aid money coming from the U.S. So the fact that the Russians can invest probably not that much, but have such high returns for investing into the information war and influencing Republicans to delay and block aid had significant ramifications for the battlefield, and on hybrid warfare as well. The Russians have been getting more and more aggressive, waging cyber attacks against all of Europe, against the U.S. And while much of it doesn't make it into the media, but you see the Russians going after targeting water treatment facilities across small cities in France, Poland, in Indiana, Texas. And the Russians believe that the more that you can wage this type of warfare, and every dollar that goes to whether protecting critical infrastructure or any shifting of resources is resources or a dollar that does not go to supporting Ukraine. And so we see that the Russians are becoming more and more emboldened on all fronts, realizing that if they're not confronted with strength, that it's only a green light for them to wage more aggressive warfare. And so I think it's going to get worse and worse. But also, much of the folks and listening to this talk are also NATO fellas. So I do have a section, I think, on the fascinating part of the role that NATO fellas have played, and it doesn't extend really just to only NATO, but just the fact that so many common people and many countries have taken to Ukraine's cause. You have the IT Army of Ukraine, so many people around the world supporting Ukraine's cyber offensives. It's a volunteer effort to wage DDoS attacks against much of Russia's telecom, banking, and other sectors of the economy and areas that are supporting the military. Then you have people on Twitter fighting NATO, fighting Russian propagandists. but also that extends to just people doing advocacy work in the U.S. in the respective countries, lobbying for Ukraine. And so we see so much of Ukraine's fight being global, with so much of the average person in different countries playing a role. And I think that's very important, because it shows that even from hybrid warfare, information, cyber warfare, is that the average citizen will grow to play a more and more essential role in the wars of future. And even on the dark side is, I think, being that we're becoming more digitized, you can have an entity like China or North Korea compromise an individual, spy on them, or get them to commit, like what the Russians have been doing, arson attacks in the UK. And the Ukrainians have also utilized just like social media, technology. You had the Russian officer that ordered the attack on Vinnytsia, I believe in the summer of 2022, that killed around 27 people. Then the Ukrainians used his jogging information on the Strava app to map out his runs, and then assassinated him. You have both sides recruiting people on Telegram, so young teenagers, to go and sabotage military installations. And so as more and more technology is introduced, the world becomes digitized. I think more and more of us will play a important roles on to support what is happening on the battlefield. And then I think a next segment of lessons that I wanted to highlight is there are certain just traditional lessons of war that have not changed, such as raw firepower is still essential on the battlefield. There's, of course, the Ukrainians have had no choice but to rely on drones to substitute artillery, the lack of artillery shells on the battlefield. And they're holding entire parts of the front line, like in Transcends, using drones. But at the same time, Ukraine needs, it is a duel of artilleries and industrial capacity. So having the ability to manufacture shells and getting them to the front, and then having that artillery duel against the Russians is very important. And so when the aid dried up, the Ukrainians were down to firing about 2,000-3,000 shells a day, while the Russians were at 10,000. And the Russians have been leaning more heavily on both North Korea for much of its shell consumption. But then we also see that it's becoming more and more of a global war, in the sense that Iran is becoming increasingly involved. We have, according to the latest reports, North Korean soldiers in Ukraine, the Chinese and their extensive electronic and other component supply chains that they're building to support the Russian war effort. And so in terms of the war becoming more global, it also means that the Ukrainians are going on the offensive around the world. So Ukraine's defense intelligence agency, HUR, has been fighting the Russians in Syria, in Mali, in Sudan. And so it's hard to fathom just how important Ukraine is for the future, I think, of not only Europe, but so much of the wars, and that will be decided. And so if Ukraine falls, what does that mean for the NATO alliance and the fight that the US is going to be involved in if we stop supporting and giving Ukraine what they need to win? And so it's important, I think, not to repeat the lessons of like World War II and appeasing these dictators, because the more that you appease them, the more that they want. So then what does that show to our adversaries? That having a nuclear entity bullying the world into submission is only going to entice more and more states to want to develop nuclear weapons. And then I think my concluding point would be just on how fast technology is advancing on the front line in this war in general. So every time that I go back and I spend time with drone units on the front and seeing just how radically different war is, like every few months or every 6 months, from when at the start of the war you can have people just like unpackaging a drone and lifting it and like just seeing what the landscape around them looks like, to now the drone operations have to be extremely sophisticated. You have just countermeasures being developed to the countermeasures. So the Russians have been um, very, very excellent at how they deploy and use electronic warfare to try to counter Ukraine's very effective use of drones. And then I think what that is setting us up for next is the race to produce AI and drones to counter the electronic warfare that is being deployed on the battlefield. And if the drone encounters the electronic warfare and is being jammed, the idea is for at least the last mile for the autonomous drone to take over the targeting and to try to finish off hitting that final target. And so just a general point, but what some of the Ukrainian soldiers have shared is, well, what happens if we develop all these AI systems? Then you have the drones flying and deciding who to kill. What if the Russians dress up as civilians? What if, like they dress up as civilians, they don't have clear military markings? Will you still have the AI drone fly and hit those targets? Well, if you don't, the Russians will still they have no respect for norms or laws or any regulations. So if our adversaries are developing AI and these drones will be flying and killing everyone at will, what does that mean for the West? Like, should we be what framework should we be developing for autonomous systems on the battlefield? And yeah, like the war is just the technological aspect is evolving so fast, and war is changing just at an unprecedented rate that sometimes it's just so hard to grasp and fathom. But again, Ukraine's story has been one of the common person and leveraging technology and being innovative to fight a much stronger power. And it shows that just because on paper a military is far stronger or superior, it doesn't mean that the will to fight and being an innovative state or people does mean that you can fight back and you can resist a stronger power. And the West should support Ukraine and not allow the Ukrainians to fight with their hands tied, but invest into their domestic drone industry, into their weapons industry, and give Ukraine the support and that they need to bring the fight not only back to Russia, but to prevail onto the battlefield. Because as it stands, setting it up for a war of attrition, it is only going to bring ruin to all of Europe. And so Ukrainians aren't asking for Western soldiers to go and fight. They're just asking to give the support to defend themselves and to protect their land against a state, a country, a leadership that is hell bent, in my opinion, not on just destroying Ukraine, but really just destroying humanity and the world. And this like axis of evil that's aggregating, is if the good democracies are not willing to bind together and take a stand, I think we're going to be fighting many more wars in the future. And so I think so much of the world is being decided on the battlefields of Ukraine right now.
Thanks a lot, David. Right, that was a very a great overview, actually. But going back to NATO, because as you know, I'm a member of NATO as well. One item in there that I found that was quite interesting. I had a question for you about was the bit where it said where James Cohen, the media studies professor from the City University in New York, described the NATO movement as an actual tactical event against the nation state. So what does he mean by a tactical event? I think there's operational events, tactical and strategic, but I'm not 100% sure. So I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's that would be my translation or understanding of it. But you see that NATO is like an aggregation of volunteers and different people, and they're fighting on the information war front against Russia's information war machine. So when you have all these Russian diplomats or propagandists spewing disinformation and trying to influence the West, you have like these this collection of volunteers binding together to resist against Russia's informational war, of which is a nation state, like Russia's a nation state waging this war, and you literally have a collective of volunteers fighting on an entire front, resisting against it.
All right, thank you very much. I think we got a question from Martin. Martin.
So Shaggy, thank you for taking me. Martin Zelig, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, Slava Ukraini, and David, brilliant analysis. I agree 100% with what you said, sir. And just to pick up on that, I just posted it under my timeline. Perhaps you mentioned it earlier. I didn't hear. If you did, so forgive me if I repeat, but there was something that Professor Roman Sheremetyev posted under his timeline, which I reposted. You can see, apropos, David, of what you have just said, Putin and Xi have just signed a, quote, partnership pact. Russia agrees to support China's goals in Taiwan. China agrees to support Russia's goals in Ukraine. Jointly, they condemn the United States. And then there's some follow-up in his thread. But I just wanted to put that in as a emphasis to what you, David, have just so accurately and powerfully presented to listeners today. And just final comment, if I may, editorializing. Here we are, and North Korean, even Chinese, and we know from previously Iranian military personnel and others were and are fighting in Europe. Let that sink in for a second. They are fighting a war in Europe waged by a barbarian aggressor against democratic Ukraine. And as was mentioned on Ukraine the Latest, the Telegraph's daily update on Ukraine, of course, earlier this morning, Putler must be shaken in his boots when he sees European leaders having a Zoom meeting on aid to Ukraine. So I just wanted to emphasize that, and thank you allowing me to speak. Keep up the good work, everyone. Slava Ukraini.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Go on, David.
No, I was going to say thank you for that, Martin. I'll just comment really quickly on the whole. I think my perspective on the China-Russia alliance is that China is happy with the Russians consuming so much of like the West in the Western resources in Ukraine, but at the same time, China does benefit so much from the order that we have, the economic trade between like the West and China. So China is very reliant on that, and so I don't think they're as hell bent as the Russians are in destroying the world and just so much of the world order. They do want to reform and shape it in their view. And the Russians are the Chinese are more than happy to have the Russians. I mean, I don't know how to put this in proper terms, but just to be a cheap prostitute for the Chinese. And so the Chinese are extracting so much of Russia's resources at very low prices, and really the Chinese and the Russians have historically not liked one another. I mean, if you think about the Sino-Soviet relations, all the border clashes, and then you even see some interesting details around the Chinese renaming parts of Russia's Far East into their original Chinese names. And so if China is focused on restoring, I think, their national pride and bringing Taiwan back into the fold, what's to say that the Chinese in the future, whether that's 2050 or whatever point in the future, don't decide to start taking back parts of Russia? Again, not as likely in the immediate future, but I think the Chinese leaders or the elite have thought about it, or about the national shame that like Russia and others have brought in taking historical Chinese lands in the Far East. And so if at some point Russia was greatly weakened, who's to say that there is not a possibility that China goes and acts on taking parts of Russia, or at a minimum, just continuing to extract and depleting Russia and its resources.
Yeah, thanks very much. And just to go back to just before we go to you, Natsek, I did get a comment. I've lost it now. No, there we go. So Martin, that deal, that pact between China and Xi and Putin, that was from May this year. So that was announced then in May. So it's been a little while. I'll send you the link a little bit later, but yeah, that's from May. National security.
Добрий вечір, Девід. Дуже дякую за вашу роботу. I think that your voice is incredible for all of our friends here. And let me ask you to speak on something, though. You were saying something a while ago, and I thought there's a context that's missing here for listeners. You know, the outside seems to want to wait to see if Ukraine will win. You know, maybe it'll be today, maybe it'll be this. And they don't recognize that the disproportionate weight of the Russian armed forces coming at this country, that basically Russia has gotten its ass kicked compared to the pounds per square inch asserted, right? So if one were to think about it like everyone wants to back a winner, what do you think they need to hear that says those who've been supporters already are. That's good. But those who don't know whether to sign on don't really know the underdog status of the ass kicking that's been going on. And you were talking about like the drone technology. I've been here since basically January 2022, but effectively through February, and I was at a robotics company that was a terrestrial, basically ATV style. And we were fascinated with what was about to come on that level, knowing that, wow, you guys are really, really advanced at this particular company. And you mentioned how far we are now, because by that summer, I was talking to a Western drone builder about AI array possibilities that I know exist in the field. I'm a drone pilot myself, and we're beyond those things now. I mean, the wave moved beyond us. So would you speak to this character? I think is missed by maybe not the supporters, but just so we can say it out loud about how really Ukraine has been the winner all along. It just needs more to get the victory part. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think you know.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a slightly different view in the sense that yes, it's incredible, and believe me, when I was out there on the front lines with the drone unit in Chasiv, just I mean, wondering if I'm about to get blown up myself, but you're just staring at the night sky, and it's completely dark, and then you just see the sky lighting up from the bombs being dropped, and then you just snap out of it, and you just hear drones buzzing back and forth, and just incoming, outgoing artillery, and it's just so chaotic out there. But then you just see these Ukrainian men who, it's not that there's anything wrong with the Ukrainian government, but the scale of the war is so massive. And yes, if the government provides drones, they showed me their sheet. They have to buy like a whole host of items, whether that's jammers or antennas, just to get their drone operations up and running. And then they have to use a lot of the soldiers use their own money to buy supplies because, okay, the government provides them like a vehicle, and then in one day a FPV drone can destroy it, and then they have to fundraise and buy it. And so just when I go out there on the front and I'm just on the front line and seeing how the Ukrainians fight and how much they have to leverage their ingenuity, but just their courage to just show up to fight with so little, it takes me aback and blows my mind that not only has Ukraine fought back, but it has, I mean, defeated the Russians on so many occasions, and that they can win if given everything that they need to win. But I don't know if I can consider whatever outcome is going to happen a victory, just because the reality is, no matter how we look at it, Ukraine has lost so many of its best people. I've lost so many of my good friends there. So even if we were to prevail on the battlefield, and Russia was defeated and all of Ukraine was liberated, can you truly call that a victory if like the greatest people that gave their lives will never live to see a free Ukraine? And so just for me, it feels
Zrozumelo.
like right. But again,
Zrozumelo.
again, it's like it for me being on the battlefield and with those soldiers, and like we were driving through mined roads, just we were driving through Russian artillery, and again, like for me it felt a bit cowardice just after, whether it was like the week that I spent with that drone unit, but right, like eventually I'm evacuated, like a van comes for me and I just hop in that van and we drive out, but I leave the men behind, and for them they'll often fight 5 6 days in a row, in those like even these drone pilots, they sleep for like a couple of hours and they swap shifts, and then they're out there just dropping mines and trying to stop those meat grinding assaults by the Russians. And it's like they truly are fighting with so little. And when you see it firsthand, you're just like, I can't believe that Ukraine is still fighting and has fought back. And it's just like, why aren't we giving them what they need to win? It's like, why do these brave, like the bravest humans are have to fight and die? And it's like, no matter how we look at it, and I don't even know how to reconcile this fact, but just literally the greatest people, the bravest ones, that went and gave their life. And then, it's like it does strike a chord with me then when you read like Western politicians or policymakers, like, I don't know, at a summit or at a gathering, and they're over dinner and just at a high level just talking about the battlefield or Ukraine, and then when you're out there and you just see what truly hell in this world looks like, and the fact that we could stop or just save so many of these lives is just, it's hard for me to reconcile. It's like there's a battle of good versus evil, and we must save and help these people. And when there's 15 to 30 glide bombs a night being dropped in the positions, the Ukrainian soldiers just have no choice, and they have to retreat because everything's eviscerated. Like none of the buildings are standing, and then the Russians just, I mean, I saw with my own eyes of just the Russian assaults of like every night, every day they're charging, and then the soldiers get the drones, they drop anti-tank mines, they drop bottles of liquid flammables, good like small bombs, and like it never deters the Russians. They just like trample over their dead. Or I mean, it's one thing to see it on a Twitter feed, but then it's another to see just like these Russians like with their legs or arms gone, and one of them is like trying to apply tourniquet and stop the bleeding, and then it's like the drone flies right back and drops another explosive, and then his life is gone. And his other comrade just like runs into a building, and there's a little hole. The drone flies right above and kills him too. And it's just like just a never-ending cycle of these Russians. And then it's like, how do you reconcile that life is not only just so cheap, but it means nothing, and that like there is this part of humanity that there's just evil out there. And when you're in the West or you're talking to the average person and you just see and you felt that evil out there, you know that it's hungry and it's like a cancer and it wants to grow and destroy the world. And it's like we talk about it at a high theoretical level that Ukraine is defending the world, but it's, I think for political purposes, it's not right to talk about this. I can't go to the average voter in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin and tell them that you're fighting to protect humanity, because politicians and I think the average voter is more motivated by self-interest. Maybe I'm wrong, but you can't go around and tell people that like we truly are fighting for humanity. Of this is a black and white war of a freedom-loving people, much like the Americans just want to be free. They just want to join the EU, to join the Western world, and just to live in peace, to have a better life. And then the Russians are saying like, no, we want to drag you back to the 1800s or the 1950s, and then we want to destroy you and enslave you. And it's like, how how is the world okay with this? Or at what point do we say enough is enough? And these axes of powers that want to destroy or corrupt humanity is like, how are we going to let them get away with this? And why aren't we giving these Ukrainian soldiers what they need? And I don't know how to put it in the right terms as well, but
I
the
think
reality is
you're a poet, my brother. You're a poet. Let me add one thing in there because you're so
Mhm.
close to it. Was the people both in here, meaning like I live in Kiev nonstop, and it's a constant discussion. But the West is always like talk about corruption, and they don't see what Russia always wanted was to add one more chip to the mafia pie, right? That was always the ambition. Like if they could have just pulled that off, like having Medvedchuk come back in, right? So I think that the West does need to understand that aspect to say, well, now wait a minute, you can pull a country out of it that's actually clawing to and basically begging you for the exact same result, or you can resign it and then you will deal with it because now you have one more mafia criminal pie to deal with, because that's what it'll become under Russia.
Yeah, I mean, corruption is like the statecraft of Russia, and so the Russians. I mean, if you go back to the Orange Revolution in 2004, I mean, Yushchenko represented the shift of Ukraine moving towards Europe and the restoration of the Ukrainian national language. And again, there was, you know, many things wrong with Yushchenko's presidency, but one thing that did happen was the rejuvenation and Ukraine and language and culture began to really flourish under his presidency. And he was doing everything that he could to push Ukraine towards the EU and NATO, because even back then, they Ukraine's, well, like the Western oriented leaders, they understood history. They understood that for all of Russia's modern history is that the most important thing for the Russian elite is the subjugation and domination of Ukraine. And I mean, if you go back to Stalin and the worries about the Ukrainians' identity becoming too strong in Ukrainian nationalism and the Ukrainians breaking away from the Soviet Union, it led to Moscow starving millions of Ukrainians to death because Ukraine was a breadbasket. But also, if the second largest entity within the Soviet Union breaks apart, why would anyone else stay? And the same reasoning holds true today. If the Ukrainians break away, I mean, not even talking about a military alliance like NATO, but just like in 2013 when the Ukrainian protesters pushed for the EU pact, and Putin realized he wouldn't control the Ukrainians through his economic alliance. He realized like he needs to wage war against them, because if the Ukrainians are a free and prosperous people, and Ukraine is a democracy, it joins the Western nations, and being a member of the EU, and the standard of living is raised, and people have freedom and democracy. What does that mean for the average Russian? What does that mean for Putin and his mafia that rule this country? And that, I mean, I don't know how any proud Russian can be proud of Putin and what he's doing, but I mean, he's arguably one of the, if not the richest man on earth, according to some reports of him pillaging hundreds of billions from the Russian state. And so when you have parts of Russia that don't have running water, that don't have toilet, and again, like, I mean, it became a meme on Twitter, but even my own family in Ukraine was saying at the start of the war they saw Russians like stealing toilets and washing machines, because like they don't have these quote unquote luxuries in Siberia or in the Far East. And so when your standard of living is so low, and then you see that Ukrainians post like Soviet times are so prosperous and free, why isn't the average Russian so prosperous and free? And so this whole like rebuilding of the Russian Empire is also just a front for Putin and his cronies to steal everything that they can from Russia to enrich themselves. So you have these mafia and these gangsters and the kleptocracy around Putin just enriching themselves while deceiving the average Russian. And again, like I think the average Russian is more or less supportive of the war or ambivalent towards it. And I think the average Russian does see Ukraine belonging to the Russian state, and it's seeing it as a part of the Russian identity. And so I think Sergei Plohin, his book on the war that he published within the last few years, is a really good read. Would highly recommend it. But I believe he makes this point in the book of, for the first time, once Ukraine successfully resisted the Russians in the Battle of Kiev and beat back the Russians, and Russia realized that like it's not going to easily subjugate the Ukrainians, and how valiantly they fought back, it began the formation of Russia's new identity, because Russia's historical imperial identity is that Russia can only exist with Ukraine a part of Russia and subjugated. But now that the Ukrainians are fighting back and still have their state and freedom, what does it mean for the average Russian? What does it mean for Russia itself that Ukraine won't be a part of Russia? And so the Russian people are now building their own identity, a new identity, after Ukraine's successful resistance against like Russia's imperial attempts to subjugate it.
Find a microphone button there, Shaggy. All right. Any follow up on that one, National?
I mean, we could do this for hours because, yeah, sure, there's actually a lot that he said that I completely appreciate. Not only that you're saying it, but your particular wording. I will add one humor bit there that when we were in the Zoom, like a third or fourth trip, so that would have been like October 2022. Stopped at this one center where we were offloading, and the priest says, "Hey, I need you to see something here. Grab your camera." We walked over to this one set. He goes, "You see this toilet?" And we're like, "Yes." Yeah. Come here. He walks further down. And the Russians, when they had controlled the center, had knocked a hole into this one area because they didn't want to use a toilet. They wanted to piss on the ground through the hole. He goes, "This is what they did. You see this, yes? Don't tell me that they're..." And he went on for a good 10 minutes about how there's a perfectly good toilet right there. But no, let's go over here and destroy the wall. And it's like the stuff that I saw in Bucha piled into the BMPs there, that some stuff that had been raided. It seems surreal to the West. When they hear it, they don't believe it. I'm like, no, this is behavior that's been well documented in person by things that don't even wind up on cameras. You're a master journalist. You know this, that you're going to hear more than winds up getting documented. It's just overload. Right? So. But they start sounding surreal after a while. Like, really? Oh, yeah, watch, come here. And you go in somewhere else, and a whole nother very surreal thing is sitting there that you can't put your head around. Except for you just got to go, it's orcs. That's what orcs are. So,
yeah,
thank you, brother, man. Incredible, yeah.
Thank you. I think two more quick points that I want to make before my time runs out is that one, while we do mock and laugh so much at the Russians, the reality is after the first year of the war, they have gotten much better in how they fight. So even if I take the specific case of drones and like drone warfare and the Russian meat assaults, is that when the Russians had previously charged with heavy armor, dozens of men, now they charge in small groups of, say, maybe like 4 men, and they're spread out so that even if the drone flies to hit him, it can't kill all of them. And the Russians better coordinate their attacks. So once enough men die and like make it into a building, and they start digging a hole, and they aggregate men there over a week, and then the Russians will drop glide bombs, artillery, throw everything that they have, and then those men that are hiding out in that building will charge over into the next street. And so the Russians, even though they're still using these just insane Stalingrad type of tactics, they are getting better at how they're fighting. And imagine what so many of the Ukrainian soldiers tell me now on the front is that what happens if Ukraine falls? Like all of the Ukrainian men, even the ones right now on the occupied territory, are being forcibly conscripted into the army. So what happens if Ukraine falls and all of Ukraine's industrial capacity goes to support Russia's war machine? And then whatever Ukrainian men haven't fled or drafted into the Russian army. And that's going to be a very, like a much stronger Russia that will be ready to wage war against Europe. And then lastly, well, not a core point and more of a wild card military lesson, I would say, from the paper is that if we want to introduce any sort of, well, a greater probability of a black swan event occurring, it would be from greater military action. So really taking the cuffs off of Ukraine and allowing them to fight, and whether they're just unleashing barrages of drones onto Moscow or into other like military installations across Russia. But I think the more battlefield chaos that you can bring to Russia itself, the more that you can bring a black swan event like, say, the coup attempt by or the mutiny by the Wagner forces. And so what was that about? I mean, Prigozhin ultimately was having a debate, and he was upset with the MOD for their inefficiencies and how he wanted to more effectively kill the Ukrainians. And he wasn't getting the supplies that he wanted, and there was just that division between them. And so he wanted to rise up and take more control or take control. And so he should have, he was on the outskirts of Moscow. He should have taken it, maybe started a wider conflict within Russia. And then you even saw the Russian people within Rostov when the Wagner forces were around there. You didn't see the Russian people cursing or mocking them. You just had people cheering them on, recording them, and the Russians were just ambivalent to a potential civil war in their land, and they were cheering them on. And so, greater military action can. I'm not saying that we should expect it, but there's just things that can happen that we can never expect. And I just believe, like, mathematically, the probability of something like that happening that just tilts the scale of the war, or brings something dramatic upon us, is more likely to happen. Whether that's a World War I style collapse of the Russian army, where just morale is so depleted, and that the Russians just decide we got to throw our hands up, and, like, why are we even in Ukraine anymore? Or just the Russians fighting amongst themselves. And so the more that we can do to support Ukraine's efforts, or these long range strikes, or just give them everything that they need, the more that we can bring about this black swan type of event that could end the war, or can just drastically change the course of it. So again, not like one of the main lessons of the war, but I just thought it was an interesting point that I'd highlight to conclude my talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Lesson 21 in the document. Black swan events. Greater military pressure on Russia is more likely to produce black swan events. I was going to discuss that a bit with you, but I think you've run out of time, have you, David?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's somebody else on after me, but I have a few more minutes if there's any, like, last questions from anyone.
Yeah, there's no one on after you. We just be talking about stuff. So I'll go to Vatnik Soup. He's had his hand up for ages. Vatnik Soup.
Oh, Jesus, so much to respond to. When the war broke out, my girlfriend was still in Ukraine, and one of the first things she said was, I will have a medical course and a shooting course. And that highlighted once more what the spirit of the Ukrainians was. A lot of people don't know history in the West, in my eyes. That's one of the main problems. And after the Second World War, Ukrainians fought on until 1953 against the Polish Communist Army, the Slovak Communist Army, the Red Army. Ukrainians don't give up, but we have a risk of giving up on them. And you were previously discussing, like, all the propaganda arguments, like, oh, Ukraine is so corrupt. And if people actually know their history, in the early 90s, Poland was more corrupt than Ukraine. Polish people were going to Ukraine to buy food because in their own country there was food corruption in the early 90s. Hungary was overrun by the Russian mafia. Actually, also Czechoslovakia was run over by the Russian mafia in the 90s. We all forget that. It's like we have this perception of Ukraine as a static country that can't be helped. And I've been to Ukraine from 2012 to 2023 about 20 times, and I saw progress. It might sound straight, but I saw progress each time in the mentality of the people, in young people. But the problem in my eyes has always been that Russia hasn't accepted a sovereign Ukrainian identity. And you can see this, that the 99 elections, Chernobyl gets killed, basically, in a very suspicious way, and the case gets shelved. We have 2004, I think it was, Yushchenko, of course, who was poisoned. Then you had Timoshenko, who was imprisoned. And now, of course, there's a bounty on the head of Zelensky. So we need to understand that Russia won't ever accept Ukrainian identity. And I struggle with the fact that in the West, people don't get it. They are still thinking that Ukrainians can get along with Russia even after all this happens. So last thing I want to say is we had a podcast yesterday in Dutch about the role of China and Japan, and we had a deacon of the university speaking, and what he basically told me, and it was quite surprising, is that in Japan there is more sense of urgency about this Ukrainian war than in most parts of Western Europe, because they see it as the key of what will happen to them if Ukraine loses. And the support for Ukraine in Japan is maybe bigger than in most Western European countries, which is rather strange if you see that, especially for us Europeans, it's in our backyard. So sorry about this whole rant, but I had to get this off my chest. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing. And for me as a journalist and somebody that just aspires to educate others, both on the history and what's going on, I think you'd be hard pressed to believe that the average person will always be educated and know history. But what to me is more depressing or troublesome is the fact that so many of the Western policy advisors really don't understand the history itself as well, or maybe they haven't an understanding of the history, but from the wrong perspective. And to clarify that point is Vox Ukraine. There was a couple of researchers that did some really interesting analysis, and they looked at syllabuses in the U.S. in particular, and they looked at how they referenced like Russia and Poland and Ukraine, and the type of language that they used to reference like Poles, Ukrainian, Slovaks was like lower language. So to reference them, basically, I mean, if I can say like lower class, lower status, whereas the Russians were more of this mythical higher class, and just like really rosy view. And so thinking that the Russians are this like great people, great power, and not going to name people, but even in my time in the last few weeks, just talking about to certain researchers and policymakers, is like I realize that some of them are Russophiles. Like some of these people that are in power, even though that they see like Ukrainians, being brave and a strong people, they still can't shake the idea off like that, like Russia's, not this great mythical people or empire that they fantasize about. And then going back to the syllabus part, but just seeing that so many of our universities and entities that are producing policymakers and educating people that should be informing policy are viewing Russia into this light, and then they take power and just they completely misinformed both about Ukraine and Russia, and they're building our policy and how we approach Russia off of these narratives and this understanding. And again, it goes back to even after the breakup of the Soviet Union, right? It's like we had all these Western press bureaus having their offices in Moscow. And again, one of the reasons why I became a journalist is when I visited my family in Donbass in 2017, and I just would read the news on the war, and I just saw how much misinformation and lies were being propagated throughout Western media, and just how sloppy Western journalism was. It was frustrating, and I thought to myself, as a Ukrainian American, I can have a voice and I can educate others. And so it took me a few years, but eventually was able to write and start educating folks. But I think like even in the Western narratives right now, whether it's like social media or those connected to policymakers, that we don't have real Ukrainian voices, or they're not being proliferated. And then you just have people who are not even experts on Ukraine, like just dominating the discourse. And if I can go on my small rant, but somebody like Samuel Sharap, who was saying Western aid and weapons wouldn't go to benefit Ukraine at all at the start of the war. How was somebody like that got everything so wrong is still having the ear of American policymakers, and is, I think, arguably pretty close to somebody like a Jake Sullivan? So you have people just completely, like, whether it was their analysis or predictions, completely wrong, and yet they still have the ear of Western policymakers. So to me, the most troubling part is that those that don't understand the history, the complexity, what things are actually like, and what the people feel, and what our actual policies should be, are completely misinformed. And then those folks are the one that have the ear of somebody like a Biden or a Jake Sullivan or other European leaders and policymakers. And then they're the ones that are saying like, no, we're not going to authorize long-range strikes because Russia, we want to rebuild relations with Russia over the war or whatnot. And so what we're seeing reflected on the battlefields of Ukraine isn't just something that's new, but it's been something arguably decades or hundreds of years in the making. And I think my final point just to add is that, like, let us not forget in the 1930s, when you had the New York Times, he won a Pulitzer Prize in Moscow, and he was suppressing the stories about the brave Welsh journalist Garrett Jones, who was reporting on the famine and the Holodomor in Ukraine, and they suppressed him, and then he was eventually executed by the Russian secret police in Mongolia a few years later. But the New York Times played a role in promoting that disinformation and suppressing Ukraine's voice. And so the battle over the media, the battle over the information space over Ukraine has been something that has existed for a very long time. And so if we don't look internally to ourselves, look whether it's, I don't know, look to our universities, or how are we producing these policymakers that are focused on Ukraine and Russia, if we don't address that, then it's like, will we ever get past that point of appeasing a country like Russia, or knowing how we should actually formulate our policy to use strength and not weakness to confront the Russians?
Thanks very much. Can you take one more comeback from Vatnik Soap?
Yeah.
If you gotta go, just say.
No, I'm still good.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. You're actually describing why I joined Vatnik Soup. And when I started studying at university like 15 years ago, I had this high impression about science, about that you have to prove facts, that you need to be accurate with your data. But then what I saw is that a lot of teachers, university teachers here, they can pronounce the biggest nonsense, and they get away with it. Like I made a Vatnik Soup on a teacher that claimed that already 30 million people had left Ukraine. I mean, how hard is it to check such facts? Or Ukrainians are losing 1 to 20. So for 1 Russian, 20 Ukrainians are dying. I mean, it hasn't ever been proven in history that ever happened in any war, almost. And then they just throw out this nonsense. And I don't know if you know the journalist called Diana Panchenko, the Russian propagandist.
Mm.
I'm the ghostwriter of that story for Vatnik Soup.
Mm.
She has a reach of about 2.5 million, and I just found out I had Ukrainian contacts who knew her personally from her student days, and what I saw is, and I want to put this to everyone who is listening here: you can weaponize information to benefit Ukraine by just pointing out facts about how somebody is lying online. And I made this Vatnik Soup about Diana Panchenko, and each time now when I see a discussion about Diana Panchenko, luckily there is somebody from NAFO or somebody else who is putting that story out there that she's a complete liar. Because if you don't, everyone who is a bit neutral starts to believe her stories about how Zelensky is a corrupt drug addict trying to swindle Ukraine. And sorry for my rant again, but I think this is our responsibility. Each time you put out the truth, you stop so many lies. You can actually stop discussions. Like Sharap, there's a Vatnik Soup about Sharap. Show it to people, it totally destroys his credibility. But if people don't know the facts, then we're lost. So yeah, sorry, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly, thank you for the work that you do. I think it's every time that I see a David Sachs or somebody else going on these, I mean, almost genocidal rants against Ukraine, and then they're just mocked and humiliated. And then you see even American politicians, whether it's Mike Lee or Albert Jacoby, fighting random dog faces on Twitter. And I think also the Russians, every dollar not spent on Ukraine is every dollar spent on protecting critical infrastructure is a dollar that doesn't go to Ukraine. Well, same here. Every minute that you have these Russian propagandists or pro-Russia sympathizers sitting there on Twitter tweeting against a bunch of cartoon dogs is another tweet or disinformation that they don't have time to put out against Ukraine. So just to conclude, thank you for the work that you're doing. And I think many of us don't realize, but the information war front is very important to the battlefield operations as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David. Do you need to go now?
No, I can still, if folks are
Okay.
interested.
Yeah, folks definitely interested. I didn't know if you had to leg it somewhere for an appointment. Right, let's go to Kerry and then Lexicon.
Hi guys, thank you David for coming on. There were just a couple of things I wanted to throw up. So you were saying about Japan and how what the mood is over there and just how serious they are about it, which makes complete sense. But this is also why I just constantly scratch my head with regards to Australia. I can't see where their bigger picture, their bigger understanding of the scenario is, and how much of a threat that the world scenario is to them as well. So that was one thing. And then the other was, I do also feel that I'm in the UK, and I think we have this perception, younger people who don't know their history, we're thinking, oh yeah, World War One, World War Two, we've had peace since then. But actually, World War Two wasn't the end of the scenario. That was when Russia started sucking up, as many countries as possible around it. And people, I suppose, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, even 50s, like me, we think, oh, there was peace after World War II. No, there wasn't. Russia started literally eating up every country around it that it possibly could. And we stood back to some greater extent and allowed that to happen. So, yeah, I think history and politics and seeing the bigger picture. We're just so dense on it. I can't get my head around it. And also in the recent history, even of Italy, of Spain, let alone Germany, we know that fascism and communism has been an incredible threat to Europe. Where is our mental awareness of our recent history? I don't get it.
Yeah, thank you for those comments. It just made me realize that at some point in the future, whether that's 30, 40 from years for now, there's going to be many, many more lessons for in the future. And then there's going to be people having probably these same types of discussions of why are we like repeating the same mistakes from 2022 and 2024, and like why didn't we confront Russia properly? And it's like, here we're in this day in 2024 looking back at World War II, and you have Timothy Snyder and other historians just saying of like, look how closely this aligns with the past and what went on, the history. And in some parts of it, aspects of like World War II is like one for one, whether that's the annexation of Crimea, then the Sudetenlands of Czechoslovakia, and then just appeasing these dictators more and more. And it's just like you sit here and you wonder of like, wow, we're here in this modern age thinking that we've advanced so much, but yet somehow humanity falls right back and starts repeating the same historical lessons that we just fought World War II over. And so I think the only thing that I can comment on is like whatever is in our control isn't in our control, and that means people like NAFO continuing to do what they're doing, fundraising, fighting the Russian propaganda, advocacy efforts on the ground, like meeting with your politicians and fighting. And Ukraine's cause has been that of the common person, and of course there's so much out of our control that we can influence, but whatever is in our control at the local level, at the individual levels, like we must just do whatever we can and influence and advocate, because realistically I've seen it with my own eyes, is like even one drone, one jammer that's sent to the front line can save one life. And so if we can save a human life like a Ukrainian soldier, it's like I think that's worth more than anything. And so each act of advocacy, each act of fundraising, each act of just sharing Ukraine's story to somebody else is something that we won't see, maybe we'll never see, because things often happen in a combination of events, like a chain reaction. And so just everybody continuing to do what they can with advocacy, and each individual effort stack up, and maybe it results in a fundraiser close and a unit gets a jammer that protects them against enemy FPV drones, and you saved one human life. And so it's like I often go crazy thinking about the war and like we must do everything from changing Jake Sullivan's mind and helping Ukraine win. But, that's something far bigger than myself. And so I focus on doing what's within my control, within my power, and educating people and fundraising and buying as many supplies as I can for the soldiers and just trying to save as many human lives as I can and just helping Ukraine because that's within my power and I think what we must do. And again, I must say that like for all the people that don't have a connection to Ukraine, I think it's such a beautiful story to have people all around the world. I mean, not giving him exclusive credit, but to all of you. But like I met with Shaggy this weekend, and he is somebody who doesn't have like a direct connection to Ukraine, and he's from Liverpool, and yet here he is hosting a space and fostering dialogue and doing as much as he can as others are. And to me, it's just so beautiful meeting, say, like naval people from different countries, of which I met many, and even collaborated with them on articles and on research, and just seeing common people engaging in helping the Ukraine struggle to defend itself and to be human. And so there's so much good that can come out of it. And so whatever's in our control, like we focus on it and what we do. And when enough of us aggregate and there's enough of us, like we start to sway politicians and change the discourse in our countries. And so as for Australia in particular, I think it's reflective of other battles that we have in the US and other countries of just once it starts from the individual and it funnels up and gathers into a collective, that's where we can really start to have influence. And so just focus on the small, focus on the little, doing what we can do will all contribute to the bigger picture impact, I believe.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David. Phoenicia's mentioned something about advocacy there. So while you were talking, my sister just sent me a message asking how I was. I told her I was interviewing you, and I sent her the link, and then I sent her a link of the interview with Mick Ryan and Becca, and she's now listening to one. I'm not quite sure whether she's listening to us or listening to Mick Ryan, but that's advocacy. She hadn't heard that before. She's busy. She's not a Ukrainian like I am. I think that's the word. What it is now. Ukrainians. We're all full supporters of Ukraine, but we've got to try and advocate for that and get the message out to people who maybe aren't so deeply involved and deeply touched by Ukraine. Just so, well, hopefully they'll get deeply touched and deeply involved. So yeah, maybe my sister's. Hi, sis, if you're listening. Back to you, David. If you want to follow up on that, or we can go to Lexicon.
I think we can. Well, that's amazing. That has transpired. So, again, thank you for sharing and getting the message out.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. You're welcome. My pleasure. My duty, basically, I feel as though it is. Lexicon.
Yeah, well, thank you so much again, David. And you really have highlighted, I mean, you're doing so much. One thing I just want to underline, you highlighted for us the perspective of the soldier out there, like what it is for Ukrainian people out in the field. And that's that's why we're coming back here, is to hear you guys. And that's something, as you say, so hard to impart to those policymakers. I think one problem with the policymakers is in our industrial and financial elites. There's so much linkages and entanglement between Western and Russian, the wealthy. That's one of the things. So in addition to the disinformation war that you pointed out, there really is that too. There's actual interests. They're opposing opposing Western support for Ukraine. But anyway, glad you called out Samuel Sharap and these people in the disinformation war. I wanted to just mention that you may be aware of a book that just came out this year, a Ukrainian and, a Canadian, Bulgarian woman it's called Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States. So this talks about this entanglement. They focus on the last 30 years. The authors are Oksana Chevel, who's a Ukrainian prof at Tufts University in Cambridge, US, Massachusetts, and Maria Popova is at McGill. and they're both political scientists. But Michael McFaul said, if you only have time to read one book on the origins of the contemporary conflict between Russia and Ukraine, this is the book to read. And he calls them the perfect team. And Plohi, whom you mentioned, says that there's a flood of books on the Russo-Ukraine war written by overnight experts. This book is different. So I think they're the ones who have put forward this thesis of these. Yeah, okay. So however you want to read the last 400 years, these two these countries have entangled histories. But since 1991, when Ukraine chose its independence, when it was able to, that there was a divergence and choices could have been made. But what they show step by step, and it's much of the history you just ran over, every time there was an opportunity, the Russian elites, I mean, there were different elites in the conversation, but none of them, even the liberal so-called opposition, still had a view of liberal empire. Not one of the groupings in the Russian elite opted for any vision of a future, some kind of civic Russian entity, polity that would not have an empire ambition, whereas Ukraine developed its civic identity. And so those, as you mentioned, from Revolution on Granite and Orange Revolution and Maidan and then Zelensky's presidency and the war. So every single time, even from, say, 2003, as you're saying, they start to show the different conflicts that Putin provoked, and that his, of course, country went along with. So I think it's a valuable book. Also one virtue is that it's really compact. It's not long, a little over 200 pages of the main text, and really worthwhile. I'm not sure if somebody has mentioned that one to you, but I would, I'm trying to get us to discuss it more on our space here. But anyway, thank you so much. I just won't repeat all the great stuff you said, but I really find that your contribution on so many levels is absolutely outstanding, and I appreciate having the chance to meet you today. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on and sharing as well. And yeah, I mean, great books. The one on the integral. I actually haven't read that myself. I have the book, but I've heard great things from peers of mine about that book. So I intend to read it within the coming weeks. But yeah, I heard really good things about it. And I would just say, just like on a historical note, if you think back to Ukraine's identity, and you think back to the Cossacks, and so the Cossacks were, I mean, basically warriors defending kind of the wildlands, and so the areas that were just untamed, and so the Cossacks were there, and anybody can go and join the Cossacks. So there was runaway slaves or people from all sorts of backgrounds that went and joined the Cossacks and the Hetmanate and Zaporizhia. And Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's, I mean, arguably the most famous Ukrainian figure, but a freedom fighter and poet, when he speaks about the most important thing for the Ukrainians, it's not your religion, your background, even your ethnic Ukrainian identity, but it's to unite around the cause of freedom. And so the most important thing for Ukraine is freedom and the belief in it. And so I think that's what draws so many people to Ukraine, even in this day and age, and what people resonate with is that both the defiance of the Ukrainian people to prevail no matter the odds, but that desire for freedom, like, just is the greatest ideal that they strive for, and it has been historically. And so, that's what Russia wants to wipe away so eagerly. And that freedom is also like connected to the nationalism piece. Is that much of there's an argument to be had that much of this war to enslave Ukraine, and that the target after Ukraine would be Polish nationalism. Well, Poland itself, because if you go back to the 1800s, the 1830s, when you had the Poles rose up and revolted against the Russian Empire, it also greatly influenced the Ukrainian nationalist movement that would emerge over the coming decades. And Plohi argues in his book this is the first force that Russia encountered that they wouldn't be able to defeat is nationalism. It's not an enemy you meet directly onto the battlefield. It's like an idea, and it can spread very fast. And so Poland had a
Would you speak? Would you speak on Petliura and Pilsudski and maybe that era a little bit? While since you're passing that.
sorry, on which area?
So in the 20 the nationalism that was trying to thrive in eastern Ukraine, right?
Mm.
With Petliura, right? And the fact that there was essentially a deal made. This is the way I understand with Poland that basically helped Poland survive, but sabotaged the ability, if you will, of Ukraine to its identity in the 20s, which sort of fed the nationalism in the next 15 years, right? That like, hey, we were betrayed once, we're not having that happen again. But there was a negotiation. There were alliances between the Eastern nationalists in Ukraine and the Poles that deferred for the greater strength of Poland to survive in hopes that a Ukrainian identity would survive after that. Yes? Is it them? That's sort of my understanding.
Well, if you're referring to what happened after, like, basically during and after World War One, but I mean, Ukraine itself was basically divided between two states. You had the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, which is basically around the area of Lviv in Western Ukraine. It was a pretty small entity. And then you had the rest of like Central and Eastern Ukraine as like an independent Ukrainian state. But the Western Ukrainians were focused on fighting and defending their land against Poland. And so even when they attempted to combine forces, they were more disorganized because the rest of Ukraine was focused on fighting and defeating back the Russians and the communists, whereas the Western Ukrainians were focused on defeating the Poles that wanted to take Western Ukraine, and so it led to like a fractured Ukrainian effort. But eventually, Petlura and the Poles, when essentially the battles were being lost in Western Ukraine, the Ukrainians were beaten back from Kiev. The Ukrainians decided to allow the Poles to take certain parts of Western Ukraine, but they combined their efforts. And then once the Ukrainians and the Poles retook Kiev, that's where a lot of the I think like bad blood between the Poles and the Ukrainians greatly proliferated, because when the Poles returned to Kiev, there was like discourse around like former Polish nobles and estate owners like speaking to the Ukrainians and warning them of like the past blood and how they might be able to take back some of their estates, and it created that like division and made a lot of Ukrainians like not supportive of the Poles who had the desire or notion that they wanted to potentially like not enslave, but just a lot of tension in that era, since historically like Poland was the noble class and ruled over the like Ukrainian peasants, and so yeah, like created bad blood between the Ukrainians and the Poles. But then also there was discourse within Poland of like, okay, we beat back the Russians past Kiev and we're back here. Why should we, even though the Ukrainians helped us, defend Poland and beat the Russians back, why should we be helping the Ukrainians fight for their land now? Why don't we just sign a pact with the Russians and take Western Ukraine and then let the Russians take everything else? And then that culminated in the Treaty of Riga, where basically the Poles took Western Ukraine, parts of it, and then Russia took the rest. And then you had like the Poles like persecuting or at least like forbidding Ukrainian language schools, discriminating against Ukrainian people, their language, harassing them, and making life difficult for Ukrainians. And so what that bred instability and led to the rise of people like Stepan Bandera and members of the Ukrainian like freedom movement in that part of Ukraine. And they ended up as like there was a lot of hostilities. They ended up assassinating certain Polish figures, and like Poland just removed a lot of Ukrainians, and I don't want to say cleanse them, but did a lot of bad things to Ukrainian people. And so that was the start of, well, help build more and more animosity. So then when World War II broke out, you had a lot of Ukrainians that wanted to enact revenge on Poland, both for taking the freedom away and how badly Ukrainians were treated in certain areas under Polish control. And so you had like the tragedy of Volyn, where you had like Ukrainian nationalists that like executed a lot of Poles, and just, you know, they were enacting revenge. And so just you had a lot of bad blood between both sides. And again, it goes back decades, and there's no answer just like Ukrainians or bad guys for killing the Poles. It's like both sides did a lot of bad to each other over those years. But I think it's important to
record keeps reflecting one side only, mostly.
Yeah,
On the bigger level.
true, but that's Ukraine's story as a whole. I feel that Ukraine, you know, whether it's you know, like World War One, or it's just like Ukraine's story has always been suppressed by all sides. Like Ukraine is at the center, right? You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had Poland, you had the Ottoman Empire, the Russians. So you have all these empires trying to tear Ukraine and carve it up apart. That, you know, Ukraine never had that historical voice, and that's why in this current war, like when people are educated and realize what Ukraine is and what Ukrainians have fought for and what Ukraine's history is so important to understand of why we're at this point today. But, you know, I will say even a reflection of Poland's ongoing efforts is that, you know, Poland is arguably, if not the most, like, supportive and helpful of Ukraine's cause. And of course, like, you know, maybe it's self-interest that Poland is just so worried that, you know, well, they will be next if Ukraine falls. But you know, when the Ukrainians were fighting basically a civil war against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, then in 1654, the Ukrainians were betrayed by the Crimean Tatars, and they needed a new ally, and they went to go meet with Tsar Alexei and from Muscovy. The language, Ukrainian language, was so different that they needed translators to talk to one another. And the historical records, I believe, in Ploch's book, they say that they referred to each other as like aliens, just like as a very different people. And so Ukraine's for hundreds of years is closer to the influence of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And even today, I believe the like lexicon of Ukrainian, and so the Ukrainian language is closer to Polish than it is to Russian. But of course, over the past 300 years, a lot of Russian crept in and influenced Ukrainian. But I think Ukraine's historical bond is stronger to Poland than it is to Russia. So if you don't understand the Ukraine's history and what role it played, and then I think the tragedy of Ukraine's story with Poland is historically the Ukrainians, I think, were close to joining the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth on like equal footing, you know, whether it be the Polish-Lithuanian Ukrainian Commonwealth. But the issue for Ukraine in that was that Ukraine was Orthodox and Poland was Catholic. And when some of the Lithuanian nobles came to Ukraine, they actually adopted Orthodoxy. But then when Poland took more power within the Commonwealth, they forced the Lithuanian nobles to convert to Catholicism. And a lot of one of the main reasons that led to the fighting between the Ukrainians and the Poles, and that led to the uprising of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, was the discrimination like of the Orthodox religion. So, I mean, apart from that, you know, we could have seen potentially Ukraine, you know, join the state of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth on more equal footing. And of course, it would have been a very different historical trajectory for Ukraine had that happened.
Thank you very much. Vatnik Soap.
Sorry, I was just my phone unlocked. But no, I just wanted to add some history on his whole story. First of all, and he probably knows this, you have the Declaration of Philip Orlik, sorry. And when you had that Cossack state, he actually had a like a state of law that protected individual rights, and it was one of the most enlightened laws in the 18th century, comparing to what we later saw in America and in the Netherlands. But they were upfront with protecting those freedoms of individuals in their laws. So those were the Cossacks. They really loved their freedom. I wanted to reflect a bit on the whole Second World War. What played a role was that Ukraine, of course, they had a big part had been the Western provinces had been part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and what kind of took place was that Ukraine, after the World War and the Treaty of Riga in 1922, the sovereignty of Ukraine wasn't recognized because some countries like France, they still looked badly at Ukraine because they had collaborated so much with Austrian Hungarians. They were so they were on the wrong side, basically. So historically, that's also one of the reasons that the sovereignty hasn't been taken seriously. I wanted to reflect on one last thing. We know all about the current Donbas republics being established in 2014, but they're actually a reflection of what happened in I think it was 1918 or 1919 that the communists established a Donbas Kryvyi Republic as a puppet state. So they basically control that area like they're doing now with the Donbas. And ironically, even when Ukraine became independent, Russia had already, on the first days, there was already a politician proposing to get this whole Kryvyi Donbas Republic back. It was Konjarev. And a lot of people don't know this, but this is how far this history goes back. Russia has used this tactic of creating republics in Finland, in Georgia. They're doing this everywhere, always with the argument we're coming to help for the sovereignty of the local people who are oppressed. So sorry, I get a little bit lost in history, but I just want to add that. So thank you.
Yeah, I think just really quickly on that, but I mean, look back to the Treaty of Versailles when the Ukrainians, I mean, you still had in 1918, you had the Ukrainian state. I mean, of course, they were still fighting to defend and preserve it. But then, whether you think back to 1994 and the Budapest Memorandum, and of course, how that was irrelevant and Ukraine was betrayed, you can also argue that with the Treaty of Versailles, when the Western, leaders gathered and they carved out territory for Poland, and then Ukraine was ignored, and Ukraine was granted nothing. And so of course I believe France was lobbying for Poland to be stronger and Ukraine to be a part of Poland, so that Poland would be a buffer against Germany. And so time and time again, the Ukrainians fighting for their freedom, wanting to be a free state, were betrayed by the Western powers.
Any comeback on that, Nick?
Yeah, and we're actually betraying Ukraine again, because the Budapest Memorandum, of course, promised something. But if you look at all the attempts that Russia already undertook before 2010, they were organizing a coup on the Crimea with Meshkov. There's a really good movie about it that the Ukrainians made in 2022. You had this attempt to create the Odessa Republic. That's always been the Ukrainian nationalists basically oppressed it. You had the Tuzla incident in 2003, where they basically tried to annex the Azov Sea. And lastly, Putin actually sat on a meeting with Polish diplomats in early 2008. Why don't we carve up Ukraine? And then suddenly, America realizes that Ukraine might be in trouble, and they take their NATO request seriously. And now that same NATO request is used against Ukraine. Like that's the axis of this whole war by basic propagandists. But in essence, Russia has never respected the sovereignty of Ukraine. Like even the first in 1993, they actually already announced Sevastopol their own territory in the Duma. Not we're landing this. No, this is a permanent Russian city. And that already drove Ukraine to basically the whole Budapest Memorandum and closer NATO ties. So people try to turn this around, like NATO is expanding, etc. No, Russia has always been aggressive, and NATO has been responsive but passive, and still they're getting the blame card for it. So yeah, this is just a personal frustration of me.
Yeah, and I mean, if we think on a slightly different point, if you think about Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor for the Biden administration, his duty is to think about the U.S. and what actually benefits the U.S. and thinking about his country and his people. And so he's thinking in his mind that we don't want to humiliate Russia, and we don't want Ukraine to prevail on the battlefield because we don't want Russia, a nuclear power, to collapse or anything to go wrong. But in my mind, I'm wondering of, maybe we're thinking very short term, maybe for the next year or two. What does it mean for the world and for humanity if Russia gets away with what it did in Ukraine? Of do they truly not contemplate that we're just full on encouraging and emboldening nuclear terrorism? And so, if Iran ever thought about, well, should I get nuclear weapons or should I not? Or any other state, it's going to be we should, of course, develop more and more nuclear weapons and threaten the world with nuclear weapons because we'll be received with appeasement, we'll be received with more gifts just to, not to, if we demand to invade a neighboring small state. And so instead of confronting Russia and showing the world that, it's not right to threaten the world and you will be beaten down if you try to, use nuclear weapons to threaten the world. Now you're just going to have more and more countries trying to develop nuclear weapons so that they can threaten the world. And so that threat of trying to contain Russia will just lead to far greater threats in the future. And I think even right now, I was reading the headlines that Ukraine is considering to develop nuclear weapons. And I think at a minimum, a country like Poland, if things continue to go south in Poland, it's why would a country like Poland not try to secure nuclear weapons if the West in the NATO alliance wouldn't come in to defend or the eastern flank of NATO? And so, the only recourse if Ukraine collapses is just we'll see more and more of the world unravel and nation states using nuclear terrorism. And so that to me is a far darker and far scarier future than confronting Russia and defeating them on a battlefield.
Sorry, I was just trying to find my microphone back there. Right. I was going to go back to the report, David, because I had a question on it regarding hybrid war and what your thoughts are maybe on how that's going to develop, because we know that Russia's committing hybrid war against the West, but I've got a sneaky feeling that it's only a small percentage of what they could get up to if they really kind of wanted to, for instance, with sabotage attacks and stuff like that, in activating Vatniks basically, and Putinistas, as I call them, Putin supporters, against the West. Do you foresee it getting worse? Because I don't think it's going to get any better. I've got a feeling it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, I mean, and I think a point to make is that there's a lot of hybrid warfare that we can't see, right? We won't see every cyber attack that happens. We won't see, every politician that's been compromised and paid off by the Russians until, it's revealed or, their scheme is unraveled. And of course, the Justice Department just uncovered those influencers in the West, and it vindicated and gave relief to so much of the Ukrainian activists that have been, saying that these people are just, flat out lying and promoting Russian disinformation. Then it was revealed they're getting by the Russians. So, I would recognize just the tip of the iceberg. Just imagine how infiltrated, and it's not even a secret, how infiltrated Germany, Austria is, both, I think their military, their intelligence services, to even politicians being bought out. And then you think, look at the Russian jamming that's going around in the Baltics and planes being diverted, to even, what was it, yesterday, reading the news, something around a bomb potentially being placed on a plane. And so the more that Russia's frustrated and also just feels that they have the tide and momentum in their favor, I think the more that the Russians will just unleash everything that they can. And the idea is inflict maximalist damage so that the West gets tired and sues for peace. And again, as the world becomes more digitized, the more that we become reliant on social media for our communication, and the more just technology that we adopt, right, from cyber attacks to waging information warfare, I think is going to be far more likely that both the scale and the types of hybrid warfare that can be waged will grow and expand. And is there a good answer? Like, how do we for many years we still haven't figured out the right answer of like what do we do with propagandists or those peddling Russian propaganda and disinformation in a free society? We still don't have a good answer to that. Or what do you do when the Russians use proxy actors to wage cyber attacks to hit water treatment facilities in small towns that are vulnerable and don't have enough cyber resources to protect themselves? Do you confront the Russians when they just deny it and say, "Oh, it's this hacktivist group or this proxy actor that's doing all this"? And then remember Biden in 2021 telling Putin that he must like knock off all the hacking, and I'm sure Putin just went home just laughing and telling his cronies to double down on hacking. And so I think realistically, the only way that you confront the Russians on their hybrid warfare front is meeting them on the battlefield to give Ukraine everything that they need to win. Because otherwise, the Russian, that point of all the resources that are diverted to support like the critical infrastructure in the West, all those are resources that are not meant to go to Ukraine. So all these hybrid warfare campaigns and everything that Russia's doing to attack the West, it all ties back to his battlefield objectives on Ukraine. And I think we should look at it that way too, is that if we're focused on countering hybrid warfare, we should look to meet the Russians on their battlefield objectives too, which is in Ukraine. And so, if we want to stop them on each of these fronts, it all goes through Ukraine and their battlefield efforts. And imagine if the Russians prevailed on Ukraine on, it would prove their use case that not only were we successful on the battlefield, but our hybrid warfare efforts played a role, and it has played a role on the battlefield. As my earlier point of the U.S. aid being blocked and Republican congressmen believing Russian disinformation and claiming that, asking themselves, is Zelensky buying yachts with my aid? And like, these are such low quality stories that were planted by a fake news site, a Russian propagandist, and then they're just retweeted. And the Russians have done this for decades. If you think back to the KGB operation to plant in an Indian newspaper the story about like the West creating AIDS and spreading it, and it was like reprinted by other news sources, and it spread really fast. I believe this is in the 1980s. And then you look at how fast lies can spread on the internet, and then you can have entire like batches of politicians repeating it. I mean, it's scary, and it shows that it's going to be effective and will only grow in scope. And I believe that, yeah, the only answer is like we meet the Russians on the battlefield, give Ukraine, what they need to inflict as much pain on the Russian state as possible. And again, the use case for that is look at the Ukrainian drone strikes on the oil refineries. When we told them not to do it, it brought the Russians to the negotiating table to at least try to negotiate us like the freezing of hitting each other's like energy supplies. And so again, like the Russians only understand strength, they only respect strength. And until we stop, I mean, being cowardice and trying to appease the Russians, like we're only emboldened and just giving them the green light to wage war on all these fronts.
Yeah, exactly. I mean that covers the cyber aspect a lot. I kind of think about more kind of kinetic on the ground type stuff. So I kind of worry about basically kind of sabotage that goes on in Ukraine, but in Russia as well. Like of critical infrastructure, like railway boxes and signal boxes and stuff like that being set on fire and whatever. I mean, we like it when it happens to Russia, obviously, because it slows their war machine down. But if that kind of action started happening regularly in Western countries like UK or France, that'd have a severe impact. And I think there's a lot of Russian supporters, as you say, in different countries, and it doesn't take many of them just to cause a lot of carnage, and that could have a knock-on effect itself by. If it was known that it was Russian supporters doing that, then turn populations against against Russians and maybe hunting Russians and getting all vigilante because their lives are suddenly being impacted. So Russians being hunted in the streets of Western countries as well, and that kind of escalation. I think. Yeah, it depends what happens. Depends what Russia does, but I see that. I see that kind of thing as maybe happening. Vanik Soup.
I'm always surprised how in Europe, especially, we don't know how long already Russia has been doing these hybrid tactics. And, I made a map for every country in Europe where they were doing stuff. And it's 50 incidents even before 2020. And we're talking about blowing up ammunition depots, organizing coups, hacking governments, hacking security detail, trying to sabotage elections. It's a long list. And in my eyes, the European Union can only respond in one way currently. And that's hit them where it hurts, and it's the money. European Union once decided not to save the Cyprus banking system, and that just happened to be the place where all of Russian oligarchs were laundering their money, and that was a huge shock to them. And we've frozen those Russian accounts, and I think there is already a law that we can, allocate money to the Ukrainian war effort. That's possible. We've been doing that with interest, but actually the amounts itself also, they can be located to the Ukrainian war effort. So in my eyes, the only effective response the European Union and America will do now is whenever Russia is trying to escalate with another hybrid warfare attempt in Europe, just hire the amount of money that you will send to Ukraine. Just say, oh, we found another 5 billion for Ukrainian drone projects. And that's the only language Russia will understand, unless we, of course, decide to have boots on the ground and take Russia on ourselves, which I would rather like, because in my eyes, there's no such thing as a third world war. It would be all of NATO against Russia, and that would be over very, very soon. But I don't see that happening because our politicians are too much of a coward. So probably allocating the money is the only best strategy we can do now. So yeah, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanik Soup. Rational.
Well, I put on my timeline yesterday. I found it interesting that the FBI was paying attention that I was writing up reports about GRU Unit 29155, the sabotage unit that has gone around attacking ammo depots in Czech Republic and Bulgaria, and theoretically behind bounties in Afghanistan. Although the Trump administration tried to quash that story. And even if they come up with another unit number, we know that there's a history of these operations. David so perfectly put it out there, like the Patriot newspaper in India, surfacing a story into the public sphere. It's all done digitally. And, I don't know if you, David, if you notice, I did a two-part summary of Vox Czech's Ukraine narratives. The internal and the external were the two chapters. And a lot of what we're talking about shows that, first off, the Ukrainians know that garden better, so they know exactly which Telegram channels certain things were surfacing, and German cutouts, that look normal at first. They actually read as if normal news if you're unsavvy. And it's traced back to, this origin or that origin on Telegram that the Ukrainians just happen to be watching at Vox Ukraine, or their subset of Vox Czech. So the more we teach and bring these specific items to the kind of pre-bunking level, so people, especially in our circles, are savvy with them, almost rote memory of, oh yeah, we know this one. It'll go somewhere. Here's one I'd like to put on the table for your observation later. I kind of went full bore on this Italian fake counterterrorism expert who tried to talk about that ISIS arrest here in Kiev a few days ago. The one guy that was trying to elude Interpol, as if it meant that there's this potential breeding ground for ISIS in Ukraine. I'm like, where? Where's that going to happen? Like, it was so ignorant to read this post, like this potential threat. I go, but where? Where's it going to happen? Oh, it's going to be in this battalion because there's Chechens. No, Vlad, that's not going to happen. But this guy's for real. Like, in other words, he really believes this. He reads OSINT stuff and takes money from people to advise that there's this gateway through Ukraine to the west where, ISIS guys will be trained. And who knows how much that Italian firm is harvesting in on contracts from people who want to talk about investment somewhere in Europe, or, that's who their clients are. They're selling themselves as threat assessment firm, right? And so it's not just the normal Vatnik stuff we're dealing with, the normal disinformation. There's this other kind of disinformation that exists in the expert sphere, including energy sectors and others, and so we got a lot of work ahead for us, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, just really quickly on that, but whether it's the tech bros of San Francisco like David Sachs now becoming like, to themselves preeminent scholars on foreign policy, or even academics that have just nothing to do with Ukraine or Eastern Europe, like also just becoming the main commentators on the war. It's astounding. And then when you're talking about whether it's this Italian OSINT researcher talking about ISIS, I think just reminds me of a concluding point when so much of Western politicians over the years are like, oh, Azov, Nazis in Ukraine, and then when there was elections in Ukraine and no far right member actually was elected to parliament, or even had any representation, and the party got like 1 or 2% of the vote, and still Western politicians were crying wolf and saying that Ukraine, has like a far right problem, and for years, like Congress wouldn't authorize weapons and any support for Azov even after they become integrated with the Ukrainian military. And then you just see the Western discourse on Ukraine and claiming far right, this, that. And then you see how bad the far right problem is in a country like Germany, and other European countries.
America.
Yeah, but then you have German politicians like Scholz just saying complete nonsense about Ukraine, and when they're the ones that having the far right problem. But yeah, just wanted to make that my concluding point. But with that, I do need to go. I will say I'm truly humbled by everyone who came on to attend my talk, who read my work, read my report, for the opportunity to speak with all of you. And so thank you all for your time to listening to my talk. And then lastly, it's such a beautiful thing to have people from all around the world to be able to aggregate to fight for a common cause and to fight for something so beautiful. And I think for all the Ukrainian people, it's like just immense gratitude. And when I tell soldiers about random people on Twitter like fighting Russian disinformation or fundraising, they're always blown away. And but I remember the other week I was actually in DC doing advocacy work on the Hill, and I was talking. I had the opportunity to talk with Senator Maria Cantwell and their staff, and then I told some of the soldiers on the front line about it, and then the commander was like, get me on the call right now. I'm gonna connect Google Stream, a Google Meet, and video from battle with my men just to talk to the politicians. But and so yeah, just like all the advocacy work that we can do, and also to raise the spirits of the soldiers on the front line. And so thank you to each and every one of you for the work that you do. And all of us plays our role. We all have all of our strengths, and when we combine, we can do great things. So for everybody, continue doing what you're doing, and for the folks hosting this channel, thank you for also doing this vital role and having me on. And I look forward to keeping in touch with you all. And yeah, thank you for having me on again. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks for coming, David. Yeah, it's very nice to meet you in real life, and love to have you on. Would love to have you on again. Don't be shy. And come shy. As soon as you fancy it, we'll find the stuff for you. So thank you again. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks all. Cheers.
Disappearing, Shaggy.
Cheers. Right, Maria. Anything to add? You've been very quiet.
Now you sound better. No, I've been listening in and awe, so I have no questions. So I was very lucky to be here and just listen. So that was good enough for me.
Yeah, I find I learn more when my mouth is shut and my ears are open. That's my little ditty on that one. And yeah, so I'm very happy. I'm very happy having people asking good questions as well. So thanks, National, and everybody on Vatnik Soup and everybody else who asked really good questions. It was very good. I prefer light touch interviewing if I can, and literally just
It's
listening.
good to have someone who knows what's going on around.
Exactly.
To talk to.
Exactly. And I was speaking to Grace a little bit. Grace knows is a big fan of David, and so is Becca. So it's all linked together. Everyone's linked together, and everyone who's people who are good people find good people as well, and they can share information and let others know about it. So that's kind of what we're here for at Volya Radio to connect people, to give them information that we find, but also try and get people on who can bring that information. I mean, I'm not military. I don't have any kind of background in Ukraine or anything like that, but I try my best. But I also know that other people do. So standing on the shoulders of giants type of thing. Kerry.
I was literally going to say thank you, Shaggy. That was fantastic. So I really hope he'll be back. And I'm having supper with my daughter, so I'm going to have to switch to listening. But thank you, guys. It was really, really good.
Okay, yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. A little bit of I don't know. I haven't told anybody in the background this yet, but I'm just getting messages. So Grace was on a little bit earlier. She might be back tomorrow actually during this afternoon segment. The afternoon in the UK. So what's that? Noon, I think it starts. I thought it was 2:00 actually in the US, but I think it starts at noon in the US. 5 o'clock anyway. I know that much in the UK, and 7:00 in the evening for Kyiv. Let me just have a look at the calendar. Actually, I'm just going to have a little look to see if we have a segment tomorrow morning. Yes, apparently tomorrow morning. So the Boom Report. Is that tomorrow morning? Let's have a little look. I think it might be, or is that one?
That's Friday morning, because I mean we're at
Friday morning. Yeah, Friday
here.
morning. Yeah, I was looking at the wrong one. My diary shows because the US segment is at midnight. It kind of looks as though it's on the wrong day. But anyway, so tomorrow morning we got Mockers and Will for the Boom Report, and then Mockers and me and maybe Grace if she can make it. I'm pretty sure she might be able to from noon stroke 5 o'clock stroke 7 o'clock in the afternoon. So that should be fun as well. So. Well, that was good. I enjoyed that. Did you enjoy that, Maria? Just wondering if anybody's got any other points they
Yes, I
want to bring.
did.
Yeah.
No, it's time for everybody to go nighty, I think. At least you're
Okay.
here in Europe. You need to go nighty soon.
Yeah. Okay.
Here in Kiev, I'm actually going through this big list of what no one's doing for Ukraine. This is why it drives me nuts when people say, no one's doing it. It's like, really? Well, it's taking me hours to pluck out the humanitarian lines, the certain things that I don't want to see for big weapons research. I'm like, well, if there's nothing going on, why is this fucking list so long? So actually, I will say to a lot of the places that are doing things, thanks, because I'm looking at what your countries are doing, even down to like helmets and gas masks, and there's a lot of little things in these big long Heel Institute sheets. I mean, several thousand lines of code. Coffee stirring stuff, you know.
I have my microphone open. Then you might have heard me tapping away.
Oh yeah, were you chewing on a big old crunchy cookie?
No, but I have got a very cold tikka masala and rice sat next to me, and I took a bite out of it a bit earlier, thinking David was going to answer a question in a couple of minutes, and he did it in about 20 seconds, and therefore I had to quickly go to Vatnik.
I've had that happen. I've had that here. Y'all go ahead and talk. Okay, chump. We're done, Chris. Hold on. Yeah, exactly.
I need some kind of I don't know. I need to get myself a little button with different sounds on it, or a set of buttons, so I can just press some, I don't know, tumbleweed sound going down just for a little bit, or maybe a snippet of the Ukrainian national anthem just to wake people up while I'm finishing my mouthful of food. But anyway,
Do
I think
like Slava was doing, where he had his soundboard of David Ruzia. So Russia's losing, like your little clips.
Yeah, I might do that. Try and get one of those things. Right then. So with that, it is. But what's that? 71 minutes of overtime. So I think that's good. I think people are getting used to 3-hour sets with me, as it were. Yeah. If I describe myself as a DJ, that means you're the records. I don't know. Anyway, it was a very good segment. I enjoyed it a lot. So with that, we can say goodnight and then tune in tomorrow morning for the Boom Report. Lovely having everybody. Thanks very much. We will snip this interview and stick it on YouTube and Spotify in a second. Once the space finishes, the next scheduled space will go up as the pin tweet in our nest, in the Volya Radio nest. So give that a retweet out and set the reminder and all that good stuff. And with that, I'll do my usual sign off, Maria. So Slava Ukraini.
Heroem slava.
І
Slava
пиздець Російської
Nazi.
Федерації.
Slava Nazi.
Смерть ворогам.
Hey, we got one. Thank you very much. Right, good night. God bless everybody.
Thank you for joining us on Volya Radio. We look forward to seeing you again. Your audience. Your audience.